Elliot Hargrave had always believed that the worst thing a trip could offer was bad weather, until the night his bus rolled into a forest that didn't exist on any map, where the road behind closed like a trap and something faceless waited for him in the dark. The bus ride began like any other, though I didn't know it would be the last normal thing I would ever experience. I had packed light, just a backpack and a small camera, because I wanted this to be a simple escape, a final trip before the kind of life where every day looked the same. The road stretched ahead in a slow, unbroken curve, winding between dense forests and silent hills that seemed untouched by time. I sat near the middle of the bus, close enough to see the driver's shoulders, but far enough to keep to myself. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and engine oil, and the steady hum beneath my feet was almost hypnotic. For a while, I just watched the scenery slide past, expecting nothing more than hours of trees, scattered villages, and the occasional roadside stall. But as the day wore on, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just an uneasy shift in the air, as if the world outside was leaning closer to watch. The forest grew thicker, the trees twisting and leaning toward the road, their branches tangled like fingers. The sunlight faded faster than it should have, shadows stretching long across the ground as if pulled by invisible hands. Clouds rolled in, heavy and swollen, and the bright blue of the sky dulled to a flat, sickly gray. I glanced around the bus to see if anyone else noticed, but the other passengers sat still, their faces expressionless, eyes fixed on some distant point ahead. It wasn't the quiet of strangers, it was the quiet of people who were no longer paying attention to where they were going. We didn't stop at any of the usual places. No tea stalls, no small roadside rest points where people stretched their legs. The driver kept his hands locked on the wheel, his posture unchanging. My phone had lost signal an hour earlier, the last bar of connection vanishing without warning. Normally that wouldn't bother me. Remote roads often meant dead zones, but the longer we went without seeing a single sign of human presence, the more I noticed the patterns in the trees. The same crooked shapes appeared again and again, their trunks bent at unnatural angles, some with gashes that looked less like storm damage and more like claw marks. I pressed my forehead to the cool window and let my gaze wander over the blur of green and brown. That's when I saw it for the first time. Between the trunks, in the deep shadows, a pale figure was standing, perfectly still. It was too far away for me to make out its features, but I could see its head tilted slightly, as though it were listening. A chill crept up my neck, the kind you can't shake off. I told myself it was probably just a tree stump or a trick of the light, but even after the bus moved on, I couldn't let it go. Minutes passed, maybe more, and I forced myself to look again. The forest blurred past, endless and suffocating, until the trees thinned just enough for another glimpse. My breath caught. The figure was there again, in a different spot. This time, the same unnatural stillness, the same tilted head. I felt my heart beat in my ears. We were moving fast, yet somehow it always seemed the same distance away, neither closer nor farther. My hands tightened around the strap of my backpack, the fabric warm and damp for my palm. I wanted to say something, to point it out to someone, but when I glanced at the people around me, the words froze in my throat. They were all sitting in the exact same positions as before, not a single head turned. No one was looking outside. It was as if they hadn't moved in hours. The air inside the bus felt thicker, warmer, as though the windows had been sealed for too long. The road narrowed ahead, the forest pressing closer until branches scraped faintly against the side of the bus. I leaned away from the window, trying not to look, but my eyes betrayed me. There it was again, closer now. I could almost make out its shape. Thin, with arms that hung too low, skin pale against the dark trees. Its head tilted again, this time more sharply, and even though the bus kept moving, I felt its gaze like a weight pressing against me. The driver didn't slow, didn't react. The trees swallowed the figure, but the feeling of being watched stayed, heavy and unshakable. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was tired and letting the shadows play tricks. But deep down I already knew this trip wasn't going to take me anywhere I recognized. And something out there, whatever it was, had already noticed me. Night seemed to fall all at once, as if someone had pulled a heavy curtain across the sky. One moment there was still a faint gray light filtering through the clouds, and the next, the world outside the bus was swallowed in black. The headlights reached only a few meters ahead, their weak beams cutting through the fog that had started to gather, thick and wet. It clung to the windows in heavy swirls, making it hard to see anything beyond the glass. I could hear the hum of the engine, steady and unchanged. But it felt different now, more like a dull heartbeat echoing in an empty room. I shifted in my seat, my back stiff from hours of sitting, and my reflection looked back at me from the window. The glass was dark enough to act like a mirror, but there was something about it that unsettled me. At first it was just my own tired face, eyes, heavy hair messy from leaning against the seat. But sometimes, for the briefest fraction of a second, another face seemed to slip into place over mine. It was thinner, sharper, with hollow cheeks and eyes that were too large and too dark. It was there and gone so quickly that I almost convinced myself it was nothing, just the shadows shifting. But every time I looked again, I found myself waiting for it to return. The temperature inside the bus began to drop, enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. No window was open, and I couldn't hear any vents blowing, yet the cold seeped into my bones. The other passengers didn't move. They didn't pull on jackets or rub their arms for warmth. They simply sat as they had before, eyes locked on some point far ahead, faces slack, unblinking. I tried to focus on the road, to distract myself from the oppressive stillness around me. But something about the landscape outside wasn't right. Through the fog, I began to notice patterns, the kind you only realize when they repeat too many times to be coincidence. The same crooked tree with a split trunk passed by again. Then again, I counted in my head 3, 4, 5 times until I lost track. It was as though we were driving in a loop, passing the same stretch of forest over and over. My stomach knotted. The logical part of me said it was just similar-looking trees, a trick of the mind, but that voice was getting quieter. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to rest them against the strain of staring into the gloom, but when I opened them, my blood turned to ice. Standing on the side of the road, half shrouded in fog, was the same pale figure I had seen earlier. It was closer now, maybe only a few meters from the edge of the asphalt. The tilt of its head was sharper, almost unnatural, and though it didn't move, I could feel its eyes locked on me. My throat tightened as the bus passed, but it wasn't like seeing a person disappear into the distance. No matter how quickly we moved, it felt as though its gaze clung to me, following until the fog swallowed it whole. I pressed my palm against the window, as if to prove there was still something solid between us, and tried to catch another glimpse. For a while, there was nothing but the endless curtain of fog, but then, just as I began to relax, it appeared again. Same posture, same stillness, only now, it was standing on the opposite side of the road, perfectly aligned with my seat as the bus rolled past. My skin prickled, and a deep unease settled in my chest. I leaned back and pulled my knees slightly toward me, the seat suddenly feeling too exposed. The air seemed to grow heavier, the quiet inside the bus so complete that even my own breathing sounded intrusive. I scanned the faces of the passengers again, hoping to find at least one person reacting, but they remained statues, locked in their forward gaze. I turned back to the window, forcing my eyes to stay open despite the burning in them. Outside, the fog churned and twisted, forming strange shapes that faded as soon as I tried to focus on them. My reflection in the glass looked wrong again. Its eyes were wider than mine, mouth slightly open, as though it were about to speak. But before I could blink, it was only me again, pale and trembling in the cold. The bus kept moving, the fog thickening, and somewhere deep inside, I knew the figure wasn't falling behind. It was keeping pace, waiting for something. Somewhere deep into the night, the bus lurched to a sudden stop. The motion jolted me forward in my seat, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engine idling and the faint rattle of loose parts. The road outside was gone, swallowed entirely by a wall of fog so dense it seemed solid. It pressed against the windows like a living thing, smothering the view and muffling every sound. The driver didn't speak or turn to explain. He simply kept both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead as if something in the fog was holding his attention. The other passengers didn't react to the stop. They sat as still as they had for hours, their bodies stiff, eyes locked forward. It was the kind of stillness that felt wrong, not like sleep, but like the absence of life entirely. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears, each thud matching the subtle vibration of the bus beneath me. I tried to peer through the fog, squinting against the glare of the headlights, but there was nothing, no road, no trees, just a swirling gray void. Then I saw it, movement. Slow, deliberate shapes shifting within the fog, too tall to be human. They were only vague silhouettes at first, gliding without sound, their limbs too long, their proportions unnatural. They moved like they had no weight, as though the fog itself was carrying them forward. My throat tightened as one of them came close enough for me to see more clearly. It pressed something against the window, a hand, though not quite. The fingers were far too long, bending in subtle, unsettling ways, and the nails were sharp enough to leave thin white scratches along the glass. The sound was faint but sharp, like the edge of a blade dragging against stone. I leaned back instinctively, pressing my spine into the seat, my breath clouding the air in front of me. Another shape drifted into view beside the first, then another. Soon there were several, circling the bus in slow, uneven arcs. Their heads tilted in unison, their eyeless faces turned toward the windows, as if they could still see. Where their eyes should have been were deep, hollow sockets, and where a mouth should have been there was only smooth, pale skin. Despite that, I heard something, a low vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't loud, but it crawled through my chest and made my ribs ache. The driver didn't move. The passengers didn't move. It was as if I was the only one aware of what was happening. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the bus floor, and I realized with a shiver that it was in sync with my heartbeat. I clenched my hands together, trying to steady my breathing, but the cold in the air seemed to creep inside my lungs. The shapes moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like a ritual. Every few seconds, one would press its hand against the window, dragging those claw-like nails across the glass. The scratches didn't fade. They stayed there, thin white marks that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes and pretend none of it was real, but something about them demanded my attention. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to drift backward, their pale shapes dissolving into the fog. The humming stopped so abruptly that the silence hurt my ears. I let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over, but I was wrong. The fog moved with them, parting just enough for the headlights to catch the outline of the road again. The driver shifted gears and began to move forward, slow at first, then faster, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. As the bus rolled on, I could still see the shapes moving just beyond the reach of the lights, gliding effortlessly through the trees. They weren't gone. They were following, keeping their distance now, as though waiting for the right moment to come closer again. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were, they already knew exactly who they were here for. Time became strange after that. The road stretched on endlessly, winding between trees so close together they formed a wall on either side. My watch had stopped at some point, the hands frozen in place, but I could feel time passing in a way that didn't make sense. Each minute felt stretched thin, yet hours seemed to disappear without warning. The bus never stopped, never turned, and I began to wonder if there even was a destination. The hunger came next. It wasn't the kind that gnawed gently over time. It hit me suddenly, a deep, twisting ache in my stomach that made me feel weak. I reached into my backpack for the small packet of snacks I'd brought, but my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. The weight of the bag felt wrong, heavier than it had earlier. When I unzipped it, my breath caught in my throat. My camera was gone. In its place was a bundle of damp, warped photographs bound together by a strip of fraying string. I hesitated before pulling them out, my fingers already trembling. The first photograph made my skin crawl. It was of me sitting exactly where I was now, staring out the window. The second was the same angle, but my eyes were closed, my head resting against the glass as if I was asleep. As I flipped through them, the unease deepened. They were all of me, every single one, taken from outside the bus. The backgrounds blurred with fog and trees, but in each picture, I could make out faint reflections of that pale figure somewhere behind me, sometimes in the window, sometimes just barely visible in the shadows of the trees. The last photograph stopped me cold. I was asleep again, head tilted slightly, but this time the pale figure was standing directly behind my seat, its long arms almost brushing my shoulders. I looked up instantly, my chest tightening, scanning the aisle for any sign of it. Nothing, just the unmoving passengers, still locked in that eerie forward stare. Something had changed about them. Their heads were now tilted slightly, all at the same angle, as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. Their eyes, once dull and lifeless, seemed a fraction too wide now, glassy in the dim light. My skin prickled, and I pressed the photographs back into my backpack, the damp paper leaving cold moisture on my fingertips. The bus jolted suddenly, and I turned toward the window. The road was gone. We were driving straight into the forest. The trees shifted apart just enough to let us through, their trunks impossibly close to the bus's sides. I could hear the faint scrape of branches against the metal, though none seemed to break or snap. It was as if they were bending willingly, parting to allow us in. The deeper we went, the darker it became. The headlights barely cut through the thick shadows, and what little they revealed didn't look like any forest I'd ever seen. The trees were gnarled and blackened, their bark split open like deep wounds. In some of the gaps between them, I could see shapes too quick to focus on slipping out of sight the moment my eyes found them. The air inside the bus felt heavier, damp, as though the forest itself was seeping in. I could smell the faint rot of wet leaves, the metallic tang of soil disturbed after years of stillness. The other passengers didn't react. The driver's grip on the wheel was rigid, his eyes fixed forward. My own reflection in the window looked pale, almost ghost-like. I tried not to blink, afraid that if I looked away, something outside would move closer. Then, in the corner of my vision, I caught the pale figure again, keeping pace with the bus, gliding between the trees. Its arms hung low, fingers nearly touching the ground, head tilted in that same unnatural way. The space between us never seemed to change, no matter how fast we moved. I sank lower into my seat, my pulse hammering, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. The forest was closing in behind us. The branches that had parted to let us in were knitting together again, sealing the way back as though we had crossed into somewhere we were never meant to be. The forest eventually grew so thick that no trace of sky or moonlight could be seen. The bus slowed to a crawl, the engine groaning as if it were resisting the road ahead. The air inside felt almost solid now, heavy with moisture and something faintly metallic, like the smell of blood diluted in water. My chest felt tight with each breath. I could barely make out the silhouettes of the trees beyond the windows, tall, skeletal shapes leaning inward, their branches curling like fingers toward the glass. Without warning, the bus rolled to a complete stop. The sudden silence after hours of the engine's steady hum was jarring, almost painful in its stillness. The driver didn't move for a long moment, his hands still fixed on the wheel. When he finally turned toward us, I felt my stomach drop. His face was expressionless, skin pale and stretched, but his eyes, they were clouded over, milky white, like someone who had been blind for decades. He didn't blink, he didn't speak, he simply stared, as though seeing through us entirely. Then, as if on some silent cue, the passengers began to rise from their seats one by one. Their movements were stiff, jerky, as if their bodies were being guided by invisible strings. None of them looked at me. They filed toward the front of the bus in slow procession, stepping down into the darkness outside. I could hear nothing beyond the faint hiss of the bus's door opening and closing with each person who left. I stayed frozen in my seat, every muscle locked. My eyes darted to the aisle, half expecting the pale figure to appear there, but it didn't, not yet. The procession of passengers continued until only I remained. The door stayed open, a rectangle of blackness at the front, the fog outside swirling like something alive. Then, from that blackness, it emerged. The pale figure stepped into the bus with a slow, deliberate motion. Its body was taller than I had realized, the top of its head almost brushing the ceiling. Its arms dangled unnaturally low, fingers dragging faintly along the floor with a sound like nails over wet wood. Its skin was flawless yet wrong, too smooth, with no sign of pores or blemishes. Its head tilted to the side with a small, twitching motion, and that was when I understood it didn't have a face, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank stretch of pale skin where features should have been. And yet, I felt it smile. I don't know how I knew, but I did. I could feel the expression without seeing it, an almost electric sensation crawling under my skin. My body refused to move as it glided down the aisle toward me. The bus felt smaller, the air heavier with each step it took. When it reached my row, it stopped, standing so close I could feel the cold radiating off it. Then the door closed behind it with a hiss. The driver, still frozen in his seat, turned back to face forward, and the bus began to move again. Only this time, it wasn't moving forward. It was reversing, rolling smoothly back into the forest. The trees outside shifted as we passed, closing in tighter than before, their branches twisting and locking together overhead until no light could penetrate. I glanced at the seat beside me and froze. My backpack was gone. In its place was one of the photographs from earlier, the last one I had, signed me asleep, with the pale figure standing behind my seat. Only now, there was something new in the image. My head was tilted slightly upward, and my eyes were open. The reflection in the window caught my attention next. My own face stared back at me, but there was movement beside it, the pale figure, sitting perfectly still in the seat next to mine. Its blank head turned slowly toward me in the reflection, even though in the seat itself it didn't move at all. My breath hitched, and for the first time, I couldn't tell if what I was seeing was outside my head or inside it. The bus kept rolling backward into the dark, the path behind sealing completely. And I realized then, with a kind of cold certainty, that this trip was never meant to end.